Is it when we were raised or how we were raised?
This podcast is brought to you by ArcMed, fast and focused design and manufacturing.
I'm Greg Maurer, founder and owner of Archimate.
And I'm Caroline Squatrigo, Talent Engagement Specialist. We are on a journey to grow, learn, and gain expertise in small to mid-size company culture. Join us.
Okay, Caroline, what's the question of the day?
I'm very excited for our episode today, Greg. So we released an episode on November 23rd of last year about the generational gap. If you have not listened to that, I really recommend that you do before listening to this one. This is going to be a part 2. And we were joined by the wonderful Lindsay Boccardo, and we just ran out of time. We had so much to talk about, so we wanted to do a follow-up conversation to get all of those remaining questions answered. But as we learned, the differences in generations that we see may be much more a result of how we were raised rather than when we were born. So we are going to talk to Lindsay today. And after we talk to Lindsay, we are actually going to be joined by our intern Gavin again and another one of our interns, Taylor Miller, to kind of test Lindsay's theories and see how this all plays out in real life.
Well, let's get going.
Lindsay, welcome back.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm excited to be back.
Yeah, me too. We last episode we left off and we had a couple really big ideas and it just felt like there was just more to learn. So thanks for coming back. We started with where these generational differences come from, and there are trends within these various groups of peoples. Gen Z, millennials. Certainly the Gen X, and even some of the boomers that work for us. So there's really four groups. Yep. But we sort of landed on this idea that it was maybe not fair, but also just sort of less helpful to paint such a broad brush across millions and millions of people. For example, the millennials, they often get this hate mail for the lack of a work ethic, but I know many millennials that work really, really hard. So why is it we're going to focus not necessarily on when someone was born, but where they were born, which is a cute little way of saying it's about your upbringing that really has a greater impact about your sort of work personality than your generation. So can you remind our listeners why it's the way we were raised more than when we were raised?
Yeah, it's interesting because both of them impact us for sure. But the challenge with thinking generation first when you're considering somebody in your life is that these generations are pretty big, 15, 20-year spans. And a lot happens in those 15 and 20 years. For millennials, for an example, a lot of them were born, the Great Recession in 2008 impacted their ability to be employed. But some of them, we were at all different spots because that's a moment in time. I was 2 years out of college. I'm an old millennial. So there's people that were born in the 90s that, that didn't really have quite the same impact as it did on me as a college grad. And so you've got this huge 20-year span of individuals. Generational research, the reason they pick the years they do are a little bit arbitrary, and it all depends on who you're looking at. They're not all. And so we say, hey, there are generational trends. Obviously, if you look over history, you're like, when technology came in, when the phone came in, it changed how we communicate, when the radio came in. All of those technological pieces that came into our life certainly impact the way we relate to each other. But those spans are too long to say this entire cohort for 20 years thinks the same way about XYZ. That's really bringing that research too far. So we think about how the environment that you were particularly born in your family of origin, That includes your economic background, where you lived in the country, if your family was a family of faith, if you had other value sets that came into your world at a young age. Those are going to impact the way you think about people, the way you communicate, the way you think about work. Those are going to impact your life way more because they're directly making contact with your everyday life. So I say, there is some interesting generational trends. Marketers certainly see this and they use that data to sell us more stuff. But when you're considering a relationship with somebody, a work relationship with somebody, hiring somebody, going through that generational lens first will lead you to biases, will lead you off course. It's too broad to put every millennial in the same bucket to start. Does that help?
Yeah.
Does that make
Yeah.
sense on your
Oh,
end?
absolutely. It's
Yeah.
helpful. And I think about in my life, my wife was born in 1982, which makes her, I think, a very old millennial,
Yep.
but really by all, um, by the characteristics that whoever made all this stuff up has told me, she is a Gen Xer, unless we talk pop culture, and then she's total millennial because she has no idea. She's never seen the movie Fletch. I don't think she even knows who Chevy Chase is, honestly.
Yeah.
So, um, but one thing about the generational descriptions is that it's so convenient. It's here you are. There's no subjectivity, right? Um, you were born in a certain year, it puts you in a certain generation, and here's the characteristics. So it's really convenient, but it's
You nailed
not
it.
necessarily that useful. So when we talk about really, I mean, from a cultural perspective, what we're trying to do is understand how we can meet the needs of our employees, and where they differ, we can meet them where they are. And so we thought generational gaps were things that we could sort of address. But what you're telling us is that there's so much more. How do we use all that? How do we use background, upbringing, socioeconomic, all that stuff that really impacts who you are and what you bring to work? How do we use that culturally to make sure that people are valued and feel belonging and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, I hear what you're saying because there's a tension between bringing, some broad strokes understanding to your team, which can be helpful. And anytime I do a keynote about generations, I'm really debunking how much we should be leaning into that. And we really need to be leaning into your stage of life, your expectations with leadership, the way you use communication and technology to talk to other people. So there is, I like to debunk some of those generational big stroke beliefs and talk about what's actually going on at the office that's making it difficult and how we bridge, quote unquote, the generational divide. So there's help in reflecting on how these different factors that get lumped into generational training. There's goodness in reflecting on those. But there's this piece that you bring up that's so important. It's this. We trade accuracy for speed or convenience, right? And in this case, I want to continue, I will beat this drum forever. Understanding humans is an analog experience. Understanding humans is an analog experience. You can meet 10 people with the same demographic factors. Sure, you'll predict some of their behaviors. Sure, you'll predict some of their attitudes. That was the real point of generational research. But to deeply know them, know what motivates them, how to be a good teammate to them, generational research is not robust enough and deep enough to do that type of work. So if you're trying to get to know your team, certainly we can look at these bigger buckets and get to know who's on our team. But knowing each person that you work with one to one, understanding their values, as a team, say you've got 10 people on your team, understanding everybody's kind of family of origin. Where'd you come from? Are you a twin? Man, that changes the way you see the world. Are you one of 10 kids? Are you an only kid? Tell us a little bit about your life. Getting to know your team and their personal stories is where you'll make that sticky relational glue with each other and actually understand each other. What impacts me more, that I was raised by a dad who was a firefighter or that I happen to be a millennial? Well, if you watch how I relate to people, you'd be like, you are a firefighter in in this version right now. So you'll see that for each person in our life, spending some time listening is worth a ton. I'm not saying to totally nix any type of research around any type of demographic. It's just holding it all in balance and being willing to both understand broad strokes, but then go deep with the people who are sitting right in front of you and understanding these elements. How did you grow up? Where did you grow up? How did your parents talk about work when they were at home? What did your parents' work look like? Did they go to college? Just understanding how their family talked about work. And that's really, I've got whole slide decks. I should send this to you where people that say we want to bridge the generational gap, I just made slide decks with questions on them about these exact things. Instead of talking about the birth years of certain groups, we start asking our teammates these types of deeper questions.
That's so ironic in a way, because right before you said I have this slide deck, I thought to myself, I need a questionnaire for team building. That would be awesome. If you I mean, those questions are great, and I wrote a bunch down.
Yep.
But yeah, that would be really interesting. And I just had a meeting with one of my colleagues, and he says, "Listen, I'm just a country guy raised by his grandparents." And I was thinking back to our conversation. I thought, man, that's it.
Nailed
That's
it.
it.
Nailed it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're bringing all this up. I was recently at a local high school talking about curriculum and how to best like match up curriculum with what the industry needs. And of course, everybody is saying soft skills. Like, we want these kids to come into our organization knowing how to
Yes.
communicate, like knowing how to like write a professional email, knowing how to do all these things. And of course, the administrators are pushing back, like, hey, we can do this, but how much of this is at home? And they kind of were like, we'll talk about that another day, and it's hard to regulate that. But I think so much of what really sticks with us and builds us as like our behaviors and us as a person, it's how we are at home, whether it's with our parents or our siblings, like you're saying. And that, I mean, I think those, I don't think I'm saying anything like really profound. I think people know this, but those formative years really leave an impact on us. And I think, to your point, if we really know those people, we can understand, where they're coming from and then how to communicate with them best.
Exactly. Exactly. And, people ask me, well, and Adam Grant, who's a organizational psychologist, just spoke to this, but people say, well, now the next generation wants to call our work groups like a family, like, welcome to the family. And Adam Grant was saying, please don't do that. Families are the Wild West. There are no rules of engagement around families. They kind of happen by nature of humans and how we reproduce. They happen. We don't consciously design them and choose them and build a culture. Typically, parents aren't thinking about that. They're just trying to get their kids fed, to school, all of that. And so it's interesting because as much as our family dynamics growing up impact the way we see work, it's also our job as leaders to help the people that we bring in the company shift out of family caretaking mindset. And we can understand where they came from and why they think the way they do. But how do we bring them into our village? How do we bring them onto our team so that the oldest person on the team doesn't automatically become the unconscious parent for everybody? That is the other piece that's fascinating, because generational work, we tend to ask that, like, man, looking forward, it seems like Gen Zs just want, a mom and a dad, and they want to be taken care of and nurtured. And of course, because the only other authoritative relationships have had that layer of nurturing and care. So you're enculturing them into a different way of operating. And that's part of where the tension comes from. It's more of a developmental thing than it is this next generation has this problem. How does that
Yeah.
hit you when you hear that? I'm curious, as leaders in today's workforce.
Well, it's timely, because one of our upcoming podcast episodes will be talking about whether there's any such thing as a work family. and there's a real mix of opinions, out there in the world, obviously, and also within Archimed, and also within this group between Caroline and myself. And I think about my employees so often, and I have um, been drawn into their personal lives to help them solve problems and bridge gaps and find resources to overcome things that they're dealing with. For me, as a business owner, it absolutely 100% feels like a family. However, I can appreciate how somebody who works for me doesn't like that description. So I don't really use it out there in the world. But for me, it feels like a family. But we're going to try. If Adam Grant is listening, first of all, that would be pretty awesome. Number one. Number two, come on to our show and help us understand what we should be calling our group. Is it a village? Is it a team? That's for a future episode. But yeah, it's a big question. Um, but here's a so we have this description of generations, which is
Yep.
convenient. Maybe that list of questions you put on your PowerPoint, your slide deck. Are there two, four, six top questions that really do impact? Is it the number of children in your family? Is it whether you're married or single? Is it whether you're urban or rural? Is it your educational level? Socioeconomic status? Like what is it really the top? If it's not generations, it could be, maybe there's 20 questions on your slide deck. What are the biggest movers?
Well, the ones that I focus on are your expectations of leaders. That's the undergirding of a lot of the questions. So, how did your teachers discipline you in school? I'm really wanting to understand the power dynamic that you are comfortable with when you're in systems that aren't family systems. So, asking questions about how did your parents talk about work? How did your teachers discipline you when you made a mistake? I'll tell you that one of the biggest differences I see that does tend to fall along generational lines is discipline at school. Because if you talk to most boomers, they were disciplined, a lot of them were disciplined using corporal punishment. They were physically hit at school with a paddle by their principal, by their teacher. And a lot of parents use that form of discipline too. But if you talk to a millennial, just the concept of a principal coming into your body space and hitting you is traumatic to even consider. I can't imagine allowing that to happen. And I certainly would never let my kids be hit by somebody, and I would never hit my kids. And so, even things like this, your high view of authority, your fear of authority, your fear of punishment is related to how leaders treated you growing up.
So
And
were
so,
you spanked is a good question.
yes, I usually go the school route because people can get kind of wrapped in their own like family dynamics and they can start to go down rabbit holes. But I try to start with the school route first because it feels a little
Sure.
less close to home, literally. But you will find out that whenever I do this keynote, I've done this keynote hundreds of times. I'll ask people to raise their hand if they experienced any type of corporal punishment, physical pain while in school. That question alone will lead your team down an hour-long conversation. It builds empathy, understanding of the other. It helps you see why people of older generations just do the work and keep their mouth shut because their history is that if they don't, they're going to be hit. That's how they understand how authority works. They don't really have any power in the situation. Younger generations who every generation parenting trends change, by the way, that's normal, and the way that they went through school is different. They're going to expect more collaboration from their leader. They're going to expect authority to be spread out more, or just the concept of power not being used as much. Then you overlay the economy right now, the power is in the employees' hands to stay or leave. So you all of a sudden, your employees, that power dynamic, it's shifting. We've got to give more space. We've got to listen more. There's a lot, every time we talk about these dynamics at work, it's like trying to calculate a car crash. It's 10 different factors that came right at the right moment in time that's created these dynamics. So That's one example of how these kind of start to overflow onto each other, and why leadership is shifting out of that authority mindset into the collaborative mindset, where it's not about power anymore. It's about influencing people. It's about collaborating. That one question triggers this entire conversation. Were you hit at school?
Well, and I'm curious about, I wonder if our younger generation, do you think they expect too much out of leaders when it comes to that kind of mentorship leadership style? And I mean, I personally think there's so much strength in having a close relationship with your leader. But if you think about it, you have a manager, say they have 5 people that report to them. They also have all of their like to-dos on their on their to-do list, and they have to build these personal relationships with all 5 people. And I look at somebody like our CEO, John. I don't know how he does it. He knows everybody like as much as he can, and prides himself on building those personal relationships. I'm an introvert. That's exhausting to me. Like, Gavin, our interns on here, he works directly with me. I want to know as much about him, but like that's one person, and I can't, I'm thinking like, is it exhausting for our leadership to have these expectations on them, or is it just something that's now like a requirement of being a modern leader? Is it now just on the job description, and we need to learn how to do it?
That is such a good question. And kudos to you for knowing you're an introvert. And it's hard for you to navigate that. There's a couple things. I am working really hard at removing judgment about the future of work. We spend way too much time going, is this morally good, morally bad? Is this okay? Is this not okay? Is this too much? Is this not enough? And what I find is that, yes, Gen Zs want a closer relationship. By that, and millennials too. I mean, they want more frequent feedback. They want to build trust with you through more intimate conversations. How's your dog? I know you brought her to the vet yesterday. They want to have that type of connection. And it's actually more humane to know the people you're working with, to understand them. That makes sense. Even when we look at research around relationships at work, Gallup, who has the Gallup has done so much research about employees, they know one of the top 12 factors of whether somebody stays at work is how they answer this one question. Do you have a friend at work? So there's no, when we say like, family, don't use the word family at work. It's going to mess people. There's other types of close relationships, maybe even closer, that aren't labeled family, that are very important. And whether or not somebody's asking too much of you is very relative. And it actually has more to do with the leader setting a clear expectation of what they're willing to do. And that starts way back in the recruiting process. One thing that we've seen that helps when Gen Zs come on board is starting with an employee value proposition. This is where we tell people before they sign the dotted line what we are promising as leaders. Here's what we're promising to give you, and it's concrete and clear. It's not friendships, fun outings. Like, it's very clear. We promise to give you 30 minutes of our time once a week to talk about your performance and your goals. We promise to give you coaching, group coaching with a team once a month, whatever those things are, making sure they're clear on that employee value proposition. The other piece that's on that, after you say what you promise to do for the employee, is what you're expecting of them. And the clearer that employee value proposition is, the clearer your expectations are, the less tension, because you can always come back to that. The other piece that you bring up that's so important, Caroline, is that we do expect much more connection, nurturing, emotional attention at work. I believe that part of the reason that that's happening is because we have a pattern in American culture in the United States to go off on your own after college, to live in a little apartment box in downtown Indianapolis by yourself. And I find that young employees are too socially isolated. So they come to work famished. They come to work starving for connection. And so when you, as a leader, start to say, here is what I'm offering and the employee value prop, the other thing that forward thinking leaders are doing is they're hiring coaches to be another voice and another nurturing connection at work. I've done a lot of work inside of forward thinking companies here in Indianapolis where they get to the point that you're at, Caroline, where you say, I can't do it all. I actually need somebody who has a coaching process to be a part of our team, to be another layer of support. This can look like a coach. It could even look like bringing a therapist on your team. IO psychology, industrial organizational psychology, is blowing up. And this is the exact reason why, Caroline, because you're like, I'm not a therapist, I'm a leader. I can't do both things. I still have to like manage productivity. So you're experiencing that. And there's some ways that you're going to see the workplace change because of it.
Well, and I think like I definitely view that as part of the role of being a leader at ArcMed. And it's like I think about if I've had a really busy day, sometimes I sit down at the end of the day and I'm like, I didn't even talk to Gavin today. And I'm like, maybe I got like my to-do list done, but did I actually like talk to Gavin? Sorry, I don't mean to keep picking on you, but like, did I actually talk to people who have expectations of me and that they should have? And it's like, did I, even though I like got all my to-do list done, like, was today really a success? And I think that's something we need to put more focus on. And it probably takes practice. So
You
hopefully
nailed
I'll
it.
get there. But yeah, it's like, did I actually fail? Not like completely, but did I fail at a big piece of my job today? Because I just didn't even talk to somebody, you know? I was too like busy doing all the other stuff. But I think that's something we need to put more focus on personally in the
Right.
workplace. And I think that's just going to be a given expectation of leaders.
I
That's
think
right. And you said it best. Caroline, you already know this intuitively. You are reorganizing your definition of success. Right now, in this moment, you're telling me that. I'm reorganizing my definition of success because we really have multiple bottom lines now as leaders. Not just did I get the work done, but you're like, I did the work, but I've got this nagging suspicion that I'm missing something. You already know this. And so that's again getting crystal clear with the people that lead you, that you are responsible to, about how you break down your energy, your time at work. There's a reason that your CEO is measuring his success by how well he knows the people that work alongside him. Because the more trust that you have, the quicker you can go as a company as well. And so you're living the tension of what matters in this moment today. How do I care for this human? What's going to matter for the future? You are juggling a lot more than ever. It takes more emotional intelligence to be a leader today than ever before.
Yeah, I agree with all that, but one of the things that I'm struggling with is, I'm fully embracing the work of developing one's emotional quotient and fully embracing the idea of a success metric that involves how you invest in or develop or engage with colleagues and especially direct reports. But I'll go back to what Caroline said about being an introvert, or in the predictive index world, a low B. And you can't change that, even if you value all the things we've just discussed about EQ and investing in relationships, et cetera. You can't change the fact that when you do that, pursuing that aspect of how you've defined success, you come home so exhausted because you are a low B or an introvert or whatever description you want. It's going to be hard to as leaders to overcome, I think, a headwind. Being a low B is a headwind with as it relates to this success metric. Any thoughts there? I'm guessing you're probably a high B. I don't know if you've ever done predictive index.
I actually, in the Myers-Briggs, I swing introvert. I'm on the line. But I'm a couple notches over into introvert. So I feel you on that we all have just so much, and everybody's different, emotional, socials, in particular, social energy that we can put out. The tip that I would give is the more structure as an introvert, the more structure I bring to the conversation, the more energy I have to engage with it. My personal nightmare, even though I'm a keynote speaker speaking in front of thousands of people, my personal nightmare is cocktail conversations that go nowhere. I am absolutely exhausted by the end of those. And so imagine, and you'll have to test this out for your own temperament, but imagine if you said, and I do this on teams as well, we come up with weekly check-in sheets that give us a clean structure on where we're going, what we're talking about. We can change them week to week, month to month, and wiggle them a little bit so that we're not asking the same 6 questions for 5 years. But the more structure you bring to those conversations, it's really about getting in depth and asking the questions that matter and not ending up in just a roundabout, shallow conversation that doesn't help either party. So I understand what you're saying. I only have so much of that juice too every day. This podcast means I change when I end work because I know it takes emotional energy and social energy to do it. So we all are in that boat for sure. But the structure that you bring to those conversations will help not use up so much of your social energy so quickly. How does
Yeah.
that hit you? Do you think, have you tried
Oh,
that?
I can relate to that for sure. I was the MC of a philanthropic fundraiser, and I'm looking out at 500 people, and I have zero problem with that. And then afterwards, I got to walk up to a high top with 3 strangers and make casual conversation, and I want to shoot myself in the face.
Exactly.
And that's, to me, when people say what's an introvert, I tell them that's the definition of an introvert. I'm not shy. I'm just an introvert, and I love the idea of structures. I meet with every employee at least once a year, and every new employee, and it does have structure. So I have a set of questions that are distributed in advance, and I didn't do that because someone told me to. I guess I just sort of stumbled on that as a way to alleviate some of that burden. But those days, we do every month we knock out 10 or 20 of these half-hour conversations, and boy, I am literally wiped. But that structure sure does help alleviate some of that burden. What do you think,
That's right.
Caroline?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I don't think I would not have put it into those terms until you did, Lindsay, but people who meet me at work and don't know me super well think that I'm an extrovert because I can be very outgoing. I'm in charge of bringing new people into the office, and I take that really seriously, and so I do want to be really welcoming, and it's not fake at all. It's like I'm really excited to have them joining. If you meet me, like, if after I'm home, like, I'm not talking to anybody. Like, I'm a very high introvert, and if you I have, like, PTSD, that's a strong word, but from going to events of the same thing where I'm expected to go in alone, I have to make all this small talk, and I think people think I'm the biggest weirdo, and I don't really blame them because I don't know what to say. But again, if I have to talk to our whole company about something, I know I'm there for a job and I know what I'm supposed to talk about, it's very different. So I would agree. It's like if I have a job to do, I'm happy to do it. But if I just have to talk to you, like you're going to hear a lot about my dog. That's all I can say. I'm going to be like, so do you know about rescue dogs? I
Yeah.
can let me tell you about this, and that's where it will go.
That's
Lucy.
exactly it.
Yeah, Lucy.
I've
But
heard a
Just
lot about
like,
this dog.
oh, I
yes,
bet. We should do a separate podcast interview about rescue dogs. I've got
we
2
can do that.
sleeping at my feet right now as I stand here.
Perfect. I love it.
Um, one thing that you brought up, ooh, I think I lost my point. I lost it. Oh, yes. When you look out and you look at people with physical labor jobs, people that re-roof homes. We just had a landscaping company work on our back patio. They have big machines to carry the load. They're not out there carrying a, you know, 2-ton boulder to my little fire pit. They're using a forklift machine. They're using, what it takes to move that boulder. And in your work, it sounds like you have a lot of emotional labor. Leaders do have emotional labor. And you can't carry all those boulders. You need tools, you need systems to assist you to make your load lighter. And that's why, especially as introverts, because you have an emotionally laborious job, you need tools that help make that easier so that you can still do your work. Can you imagine if all my landscaping friends came over and they carried that boulder together and they went as fast as they could to the backyard? Would they have any energy to make a decision about where that boulder should be placed? They're exhausted. They're just like, phew, I moved that sucker. So, this concept of emotional labor is real. I have a lot of friends who are coaches and therapists and CEOs and leaders who are experiencing this as well. So, as much as you can bring tools in to help move some of those boulders, Do it. You don't have to do it all yourself. That's not possible. It's much easier to understand than the physical realm, isn't it? We wouldn't expect these talented men to pick up that boulder themselves. It's a lot easier to, same thing with roofing. You wouldn't expect, hey, you got to get on the roof. I don't have a ladder. Good luck. And then we blame them for not being able to get on the roof. That's kind of what we're talking about here. Translate your work into physical realm and you'll see, you know what? I need some tools. I do. I
Yeah.
need some resources. I cannot roof the entire house by myself. I cannot do these jobs by myself and without tools.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it's a good way of thinking about it. Like, we don't always put emotional labor into the same mind frame as physical labor, but I think it impacts us in similar ways. Like, we're exhausted after either of them, or some of us, I should say.
Yeah.
I do know some very high extroverts who live off of it, but I will be exhausted.
Yep.
Last time we talked, you brought up a really good point on technology and the shift in technology and the impact that that has had on our workforce across different ages and generations. And I can tell you, so I'm only 25, relatively young. Um, I already feel so old when it comes to like I'm working with all these like 21-year-old interns who are already like telling me the best technology we need to be using, and I already feel so behind the times. And I'm okay with that, but I can imagine, like, it's even worse for people who are older than me, you know? And I
Oh,
already
sure.
feel anxiety and, like, I don't know anything about this, like, I need to learn about this, it's gonna be a burden if I'm being honest with myself, probably something I have to do, but maybe not the most fun thing. How do we I'm wondering, like, if you're a 21-year-old, you're really excited, you have this great idea about new technology or whatever that we should be investing in. How do you approach that conversation with, like, a leader who's maybe a couple of generations older than you and might not be as open to it or might see it as just, like, an anxiety-inducing conversation? How do you have that conversation?
Well, I love that you can just say that. You just freed up other people, Caroline, by saying, like, hey, I'm 25. Okay, I have a smartphone. Okay, I do TikTok. All right.
I don't know, I don't actually do TikTok. I would like to be clear. I do not know how to use
Caroline,
TikTok.
let's be very clear. Caroline is not a TikTok user. All right,
No.
folks, that I misspoke.
So
I was really speaking on behalf of myself. I'm 37. I do enjoy a good TikTok and trying to
see,
create
you're ahead of that's my I think I might be behind some 25-year-olds, but
I love it.
if it frees up older like, I would like to be clear, I'm behind on technology.
I'm 45 and I don't have any technologies, social media other than LinkedIn. So there's that.
I
Great.
barely know how to Instagram. It's bad.
Okay, let's talk about this because there's a theory that I want to walk through with you real quick that you can bring to your team. Okay. Technology is only as good as its purpose. So the crosshair, make a little X on a piece of paper. The crosshair is what you're actually trying to accomplish in general. Let's say customer service. We want to enhance customer service because this is think about from a leadership principle level. There's that principle crosshair of we're trying to get better in these areas. Let's go with customer service for an example. Now, the other crosshair that comes later is the technology that actually works that makes our life easier. But those leadership principles are not changing. The technology may change. And so, what happens, and you see this, I see this all the time, is that technology leads the principle instead of vice versa. So, you say, like, oh, there's this cool new app. Oh, let's use Slack. Let's do it. You know, we're gonna make Slack our thing because Slack is all of a sudden the cool new shiny thing, and we're all gonna use it. But what are we trying to accomplish in our leadership principles and our values that Slack is actually contributing to? Or is it a distraction? So we think about, let's go back to customer service. Say you're thinking, we're going to upgrade our CRM. We're going to HubSpot because HubSpot offer these three services that we know will impact the client experience. Too often we'll say, hey, there's a brand new CRM that's really cool. We should check it out. But we're not actually starting with the principle and the thing we're trying to accomplish. And so we get in this, what comes first? Is the cart leading the horse because there's a new tech piece that matters? So all that to say, If you have young people on your team, which you absolutely need to have, you need to have a span of 25 years on your team to make the best decisions. We know this. So you do want young people bringing these ideas, but ask them for that first crosshair. Help me understand. You're going to have to sell to me how this impacts our leadership principles. Which leadership principle will this help us live out better? How will this improve something that we're doing right now? How does it make it better? Because there's 50 CRMs out there, and they're all, at the end of the day, they're all accomplishing the same thing. So I don't want to jump from one to the next, to the next, to the next, just because it's the cool new shiny thing. So I need to know why this one impacts us on a principle level. And that's why it's so important to have more experienced people on your team, because they understand these bottom line principles that create a better experience for the client. Where the young people, you can say, hey, we're trying to figure out one thing that we're learning. Let's say one thing that we're learning is that video inside of email helps people feel more connected to our brand. And then your young team can say, I'm going to go find the best 2 email services that allow you to put a video inside of your email. You see how these 2 pieces kind of overlap, but they have to go in that order?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think being able to articulate like the why behind something is always really important. And I think that's sometimes where I struggle if I can't fully understand that. And sometimes it is because I don't have a full grasp of the technology. I'd like to be very clear. Often it's because I'm not understanding the value. But there's usually a lot of value to bring. But I think there also is a lot of just stuff out there that we might not need.
You
And we
nailed
need
it,
to be aware of
Caroline.
that.
That's exactly right. You're nailing it. It's both of those.
Yeah, the technology is not the goal, but the tool. Um, Lindsay, this has been such a wonderful session with you. Learned a great deal. I wrote down. I have a lot of notes that I wrote down, and I'm pretty confident we're going to be able to take some of this and turn it into action inside of Archimate. And I'm sure that our listeners appreciated your perspective on refocusing from the generational gaps to some of these other things that have deeper meanings. Thanks so much for spending time with us. This was so fun. And I'm glad we could pick up where we left off, because it did certainly felt incomplete the last time. And I'm so happy we had the opportunity to do this today.
Yes, thank you for having me. I appreciate you all so much. Your thoughtful questions make such a huge difference in the quality of our conversation. So thank you for taking the time to prepare. And I'm glad that we got to spend this time together. I'll get that slide deck to you later today, and then anybody that wants it can have it.
That's so fun. Thanks so much for sharing that slide deck. Can't wait.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. So, as always, we had a great discussion with Lindsay. I know Greg and I both really appreciate talking to her, and she brings a lot of energy to the podcast when you have 2 people like Greg and I who just don't even know what to do with ourselves in social situations, like we talked about. So, we wanted to test out Lindsay's theories a little bit. As Lindsay mentioned, she did send us some questions that we could use to start a conversation around how people grew up and how that might impact where they are today and how they behave in the workplace. So we decided to invite our own intern, Gavin, on. As you know, he has a big part in the podcast. So Gavin, welcome back. And we also have Taylor Miller, another intern at ArchMed. And you guys, I think you're both Gen Z, right? You're both similar in age. I think you both identify that way.
Yes, we are. We are the Gen Z.
You're the Gen Z part of ArchMed. So, but I decided to pick the 2 interns that I work with most, honestly, because I thought they would agree to it easiest. And luckily they did. So thank you guys for coming on. So yeah, I took a look at your PIs. If listeners have been following us this whole way, we did an episode on PI, and it's really just shows kind of how you behave in the workplace and how you like to work. And you guys have very different PIs, so you're pretty much opposite. I think you have one drive that's kind of on the same side of the chart, but other than that, everything is opposite. So I wanted to start with you guys and ask a couple of these questions.
So let's go with, what did your parents teach you about the value of work?
So I remember in high school, for the longest time, my parents didn't really want me to have a job because I was so busy with school and doing good in school and sports and clubs. I was very involved in high school. But then when I turned 16, I really wanted to start making my own money. And so I wanted to get a job. My stepdad was really for it, wanted me to get a job, but my mom was kind of against it. But I kind of was able to convince her. And then so I did get my first job when I was 16. I worked in a cornfield. I detasseled for like a agriculture company, and it was probably the hardest job I've ever had in my life. It was 2.5 weeks, probably 10 or 11 hours a day in the summertime, and there was a lot of times where I wanted to quit. Actually, it was so hard. It was tiring. I got sunburnt. I got corn rash. I don't know if you know what that is, but hurts a lot.
I don't. I think
Um,
I'm happy not to, but
yeah,
maybe you
no,
can fill me in
you
later.
spend hours walking through the cornfield and detasseling corn, and like it scratches your arms and your legs and stuff like that, and you're already sunburnt. So, but yeah, I wanted to quit so bad, and all of my friends, like I did it with my friends too, because like that was just like a very common job in the place that I grew up. But yeah, all my friends, they kind of like would go for a few days and then leave and then come back and then leave. But my parents definitely made sure that I got up every morning at 6 o'clock, and I would spend all day there, no matter how much I wanted to quit, no matter how much I wanted to leave. They definitely like reinforced the idea that I signed up for it, that I needed to follow through with it. So definitely taught me a lot of lessons, as I continue to work throughout high school and college, obviously. Um, to kind of like, if I sign up for something, I got to deal with, what I sign up with and stuff like that too. So
Well, and I know that you work a lot of hours currently, right? Because you obviously you work for ArcMag a couple hours a
yeah,
week, but you also you have a second job that every time I say, Taylor, what are you doing this weekend? You say working.
yeah,
So do you
yeah.
think, where do you think that work ethic comes from, in high school when your parents were like, no, you committed to this, you have to follow through?
I think in a way, also now, like I'm kind of an adult and I do pay for my own college and my own car and for all the things that I kind of like own and I want to have. So I mean, obviously, if I own something or I want to have something, I got to pay for it myself. And my parents, like, they support me in some ways, but I mean, this is kind of the thing I took on going to college and all that stuff. So I think it's my responsibility for sure to be able to support myself enough to be able to do these things.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So, Gavin, what about you? What did your parents instill about you about when it comes to working?
Yeah, so they had an interesting view on it, I think. So I grew up in a really small town, pretty blue collar, and they kind of wanted me to get a job right after, like, kind of the end of towards my high school. When I got a car, obviously I had to pay for, that and then, gas. And so they forced me, they enforced me, but they encouraged me to get a job. And I started off, doing landscaping. And then I worked kind of a lot of side jobs. Like I worked for a security company where I was crawling through attics, running wire for these security cameras and just like a lot of, blue collar jobs. And, my parents kind of sat me down after every job and they're like, do you enjoy this? And I'm like, no, it sucks. And they're like, good. Because like, if you look at all these people like kind of in our hometown, they all work super hard, but they still struggle. And so they kind of taught me like, hard work is important, but hard work's not everything. And unfortunately, in this world, you don't get rewarded for working the hardest. Because if that was the case, all these blue collar jobs would be getting paid, millions of dollars. But unfortunately, that's just not how the world works. So they kind of just taught me, hard work, you need it. But what you need more is you need to learn how to think, how to solve problems. Because if you want to kind of get those higher end jobs to be successful, that's what kind of really matters. And, to work on your soft skills, to put yourself in a position where you can be successful. Because just in this world today, that's kind of what you need in order to be successful.
Well, and I know, so before you worked for ArchiMed, you worked at Buckle, and I think that involved a lot of like customer service.
Correct.
Did you take that on to work on your soft skills, or did you think about that at all going into that role, that it would be a good opportunity to interact with people a lot?
Yeah, that's exactly why I took the role actually, because I knew I've never had a job where I've had to really interact with people all the time. And so I knew that was something that I really wanted to improve on because just kind of listening to what my parents had told me, that's something that, would be really important for me. So that is why I took on that kind of sales internship and did work on my soft skills.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's interesting, like, how all those little things add up and impact us. I can tell you, like, we were required to be in 2 activities, and one of them had to be a sport, and then I think starting at 15 years old, we it was like, "Yep, you're getting a job." So, and I think that's had a good impact on me as well, and just, instilling that work ethic, I guess. Although I will say, like, when I was a lifeguard, that was not my favorite thing to do. Like, I don't want to complain too much because you get to sit outside at a nice pool and everything. But I think it did teach me, like, I do not want to be doing something anywhere close to like labor intensive. And I know that being a lifeguard is not labor intensive, at least not where I worked. But every now and then you had to swim out into the middle of the lake to the raft with all these kids, and they were great kids, and I was like, this is not for me. Like, so that's when I made a hard turn into business and decided I would like to be in an air conditioned office. Well, great. Okay, my next question, and I'm I I'm excited to ask this because I like you guys grew up at the same time, right? And
Mm.
I think technology has changed so much. But how did you do research when you were in elementary school?
So yeah, actually we use encyclopedias a lot. Doing all your research was going to be just as easy as going to a Google search bar. We still learned how to use encyclopedias, and I think that's just because I was from a super small town, and they just kind of believed in doing things, maybe doing things that's more challenging, and obviously using encyclopedia is a lot more difficult than using Google. And so,
It
for
built
whatever
character,
reason,
though, didn't
yeah,
it?
it is a character building moment for sure. But we use encyclopedias to do research.
That it's so wild to me because, I'm not that much older than you, but I'm a few years older than you. And I remember one project, and I think I had to like talk about how thunder is made, or like why it thunders or something like that. And by the way, I made everything up, and I think it was very obvious. But that was the one project I remember in like kindergarten or something where they like turned us loose in the library, and they're like, you need to learn how to use a book to find research. And I have to be honest, I never used that again in my life. But I do think it's probably important to learn. I kind of wish that they had challenged us more with that. But what about you, Taylor?
Yeah, we kind of already had a discussion about it, but like I'm completely opposite from Gavin. Like in elementary school, I don't remember any single time where I use like an encyclopedia to do research or anything like that. So I mean, we still use the library. We still had a library that we could use with books and nonfiction and stuff like that. But yeah, we definitely use a mix of the internet, Google, and books in the library, research books too. So
How do you think that has impacted you guys today? Like, Gavin, you have this skill set of manually doing something. Do you think you bring that into like the workplace now, or do you think you've kind of fully converted to always doing things like the most, I don't want to say high tech way because like Googling isn't like hard, but maybe like a more technological way?
Yeah, I definitely have noticed in college that I've kind of done. It's taken me longer to do projects for certain classes, I would say, and than other kids because for whatever reason, maybe now I know why, is because always having to use encyclopedia and taking my time to really flip through a bunch of different pages. But it takes me a lot longer to research things now. So I don't know if that benefits me or hurts me. I would definitely say I definitely take my time, when researching, and I still obviously use Google now and all that, but it definitely takes me a lot longer.
Do you trust like internet sources, or do you think you're more skeptical of them?
I'm definitely more skeptical. I would say, I mean, I can remember we had a class, definitely, I think it probably middle school or maybe freshman year of high school, where we went over like what websites to trust and to not trust, and how to deeply dive into whether if they're trustworthy or not.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, what do you guys think between, I only asked you a couple of questions, but do you feel like there are some other things at play besides just like the time frame that you were born when it comes to how you're currently operating in the world and the workforce today? What do you guys think?
I think I kind of want to just add a comment. It's so
Yeah.
interesting that I got asked to do this podcast because every single semester I take like some type of management or business class that we do a section about generational differences and gaps in the workplace. And I literally had a class yesterday where we talked about these things. And so, to kind of answer your question, I do think there are a lot of other factors that play into like the way people work and how different generations and how older and younger generations they're different, but they can be the same, and how they have to kind of work together to be successful. But we learned that there's a lot of things like what people are motivated by, what events people grew up in that have impacted the way that they view like the workplace or um, that environment, and how workers prefer to interact with authority figures and managers and their coworkers in general too. So I do think there are a lot of other factors as well that play a big role in how people work together from different generations.
So I'm curious, Taylor, you just took a class on this. How do they teach it in your class? Like, what's the academic perspective on it?
For us, what we've done so far is we've learned a little bit about ourselves. So I think we took I don't know if you've heard the Myers-Briggs test or whatever, but we took
Yeah,
that
yeah, I
this
had to
year.
take that at school. I'm
Yeah,
like the worst one that you
yeah,
can get.
it takes so
That was
long. Well, we didn't take the exact one, but we took one that is very, very similar to it, but a very short version of it. So we kind of learned about how we were like in the classroom, and then that how that kind of translates to work environments and stuff like that. I mean, the basics of what we learn in the classes where I do learn about generational gaps, it's um, I don't know, like baby boomers and the way that they communicate, their preferences on communication for like face to face and stuff like that because they didn't, have access to, internet all the time when they were growing up in the workforce and compared to us where we have a huge social media presence and like just the internet has always been around for us. So it's definitely interesting to see those differences there for sure.
Yeah, and I think to your point, technology and, using communication is a great example. The way that we communicate has changed so much, and I think that probably is one. And we talk about it with Lindsay. Technology has changed so much across the generations, and I think that's one where we can say, you know, a lot of like you brought up, baby boomers tend to want to communicate in person. I would say millennials, Gen Z are like very comfortable, almost like uncomfortable communicating in person and more comfortable via technology. Um, but I wonder about, and I don't, you guys don't have to answer this unless you have a good answer. I'd love to hear it. But I wonder about like the content of the communication, right? Like how much does that really differ? And is that what's really impacted um by how we grew up, so like maybe we want to communicate in different forms, but like our is what we're saying the part that's like really different, and that's more what matters. I don't know. Now I'm just asking hypotheticals.
Yeah, I think actually, definitely technology does play a huge part in it. And I think kind of going off of how content is delivered and received, think one thing that we'll start to see here soon is the concept of cold calling will disappear because people, as our generation, kind of keeps going on, I think we're going to notice that people would much rather text each other than answer a phone call. And so I think businesses are going to realize that and start to, and you can see it now where a lot of businesses have all the chat boxes on all their websites because that's how people would rather communicate now.
Well, and I know, I mean, we post jobs on Indeed, and I've never used this feature, but you can text out your job link like to people,
Yeah.
and it can all be done like via text, like the application, like texting the application, them applying. Again, I haven't tested it, so I don't know what all is involved in that, but there's like a whole setup for like this will all be done via text. And I think that's probably, Gavin, to your point where we're going. I mean, I hate cold calls. They do make me uncomfortable. Well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate having you on, and it's always fun to get some new voices on the podcast. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us
Thank
on.
you.
There's so much to digest here, but one of the things I really liked was her statement, and I'll paraphrase here: understanding humans is an analog experience. So you can't deeply understand someone and how they're motivated through these broad, huge generational descriptions. You had to go deep with the person right in front of you. And it's just too easy and convenient to use a description of the entire generation and apply it to one person that you don't really know yet. And it also, in your mind, might relieve you of the need to get to know them because you say, oh, I already know them, I'm a millennial. And it's not really accurate. It's not really helpful.
Yeah, I'm glad that we talked about this because, I was thinking after our last conversation with Lindsay, we shouldn't generalize, but there are some things where you think about like big events that impacted generations or just kind of like how we operate, whether it's with technology or how we prefer to communicate. But this, I feel like, really gets to Lindsay's point in that while I, as a millennial, may not prefer like face to face communication or phone calls or, getting to know my Uber driver or something like that, there's so much deeper about why I act the way I do in general or in different situations that's based in how I was raised and the experiences I had growing up. And those are what really counts, right? Like if I prefer to be communicated by text, but Gavin prefers call, like I'll call him. It's not that deep. But there are things about like specifically how I communicate or the words I choose or whether I enjoy getting lunch with somebody or not, that's much more rooted in what my childhood was like, right? And we
Yeah.
all have a unique childhood and how we were raised.
Yeah. And going back to our guest, Paul Ashley, who mentioned as a leader, it's your job to remove the barriers and make others comfortable. So that's why you pick up the phone and call Gavin rather than just text, which might be your preference. And you're right. There's how you were raised is a huge difference. My wife was born in 1982, but how she was raised puts her much more into the Gen X category of descriptions than it would the millennial category of descriptions. And other things like, are you a twin? Are you an only child? Do you come from a family of 10? Are you married? Are you single? Divorced? Did you grow up on a farm? Do you love the city? Do you have a PhD? Or do you work with your hands in a technical capacity? All those things contribute, I think, to a greater extent than your generational label does.
Yeah, absolutely. We also talked a bit about kind of the morality of work practices, right? Because I had some questions about am I a good manager for doing this? Am I a bad manager for doing that? And, of course, there are ethical boundaries and just, you want to be respectful to everyone. But Lindsay brought up, we spend too much time thinking about really like what we should be doing rather than figuring out what works best for us and for the people that we work with. And she did go into things like typically younger generations want more frequent feedback. So you make sure you build that in to however you're operating, but there isn't one specific like best method of doing that. You need to figure out how that will work best for you and your people.
Yeah. We did talk about how the generational uh, divisions could be an aspect of consideration. I mean, they're clearly too big, 20 years
Hmm.
to really have a singular kind of impact. It's more of a bias. But one thing Lindsay mentioned is that to have the best, most creative and thoughtful teams is you do need a span, and she said of 25 years. And I thought that was pretty interesting. When you're building teams, it never occurred to me to think about age, but Lindsay's studies and research suggest that I should consider age and have a diversity of age on a team in order to have that most creative and thoughtful team. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it was. And it kind of played into our conversation about technology too, and whether or not, you should use a technology just because it's there. And I think that's why having that span of 25 years is really important, because you may have somebody who's just entering the workforce who, looks at something new and shiny and wants to use it just because it's this new best thing. Whereas if you're somebody who's been in the workforce for 20 years, you can say, does this really make sense? Is this something that's going to help us or hurt us? And it may or it may not, but that's kind of for the team to figure out. And that's why it's best to have all those diverse opinions, because you can have, somebody a little younger bringing all these ideas to the surface, these new technologies, have some more experience to say like, hey, we're not sure if this is going to make practical sense.
Yeah, yeah. And that kind of thoughtful discourse is what we're looking for. Let me ask you a question, Caroline. When you misbehaved in elementary school, were you paddled?
No.
Was
No,
that
if somebody tried to physically like invade my space, I would have not been happy.
yeah? So that's an interesting barometer that Lindsay mentioned.
Yes.
That if you were paddled in school, your view on authority, on power dynamics, on rules, discipline, leaders, so different than if the concept is completely foreign to you. What do you think of that?
I mean, it makes total sense. And I will say, I know my parents had experiences like that. My dad always joked about, there was a paddle on the wall in the principal's office that he may have experienced a couple of times in his day.
Maybe,
I know
theoretically.
my mom, I think, got smacked on the hand with a ruler or something like that. Um, but yeah, I think it does make sense, because if you grow up that way, you have a much different view of authority and almost like the impact that you'll accept, I guess, if that makes sense. So if you have that experience where you have, you know, been around a paddle or been slapped on the hand with a ruler, you might be okay with somebody just shutting you down or being very brisk or saying, this is what we are going to do. Whereas me, I grew up and everybody wanted to hear what I had to say. And maybe if I was doing something wrong, it was a conversation rather than a slap on the hand. And so that's kind of what I expect from my leadership is, even if I'm wrong, like tell me why I'm wrong, right? I want to know the why. I don't just want to know that you're wrong.
Yeah, and it could be that they are okay with the proverbial paddle, the verbal paddle, but it could be that they don't go to that point, that they shut down or shut up so that they can avoid the proverbial verbal paddle.
Hmm.
And that's one thing that, if we can, because we want everyone to contribute to the conversation, even if they think they're going to be wrong, or even if they're going to proffer a position in opposition to the leader, it's the leader's job, in my view, to create enough safety so that somebody who is scared about getting paddled, so to speak, will still speak up.
Yeah, I agree. And we talked a bit about, what is a leader or a manager's role in creating that space with Lindsay and getting to know your not only like your direct reports, but just everybody that you work with in a deeper level, right? Getting to know who they are, what they're going through, what they need help with. And I brought up sometimes I'm an introvert, and as much as I want to have those conversations, if I have a long day, it's something I really have to think about. which isn't a bad thing, but it's something that I need to consciously work on. Whereas if you're an extrovert, that might come really naturally to you. And Lindsay brought up a good point that, some workplaces have noticed this and they may bring in, a professional coach to work with the workforce for people who feel like they need the extra time with leadership to just help supplement things so that everybody feels like they're being taken care of. I guess my only thing with that is I wouldn't want managers then to become disconnected from their employees, right? So there definitely have to be a balance there.
Yeah, and the coach is a tool, but there are other tools. And what was the analogy she used about the landscaper and the big rock?
Yeah, it was like you wouldn't like you can use technology, right? So if there's a giant rock, you're gonna get a forklift. You're gonna get that's probably not the right machine. I'm really showing my knowledge here. But if you have something big to move, you're gonna use a big piece of machinery, right? So
Right.
if you have in the workforce, if you have a big like workload, then you need to use the tools at your disposal to help with that.
Yeah.
And I
So
thought that was a
emotional
great,
labor, right?
yeah, the emotional labor of it all.
Yeah, they require tools. And I tell you, I was never taught this in business school. That emotional labor needs tools. In many ways, it seems that I should have minored in psychology rather than international business, and that would have served me well. But the long and short of it is, I'm going to make an effort to avoid these generational labels and paint everybody with such a broad brush, and think more about building teams with that diversity of age. Those are two great learnings for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think really for me it's like the don't prejudge anyone if you haven't actually sat down to talk to them yet, right? Like I shouldn't assume that a younger employee wants to just come in and do like the bare minimum, which often get that label gets slapped on the younger generations of being a little, less hardworking. Which I don't tend to assume that because I'm of that generation, but I think where I can work is sometimes I assume that someone from an older generation doesn't want to listen to me, right? Before I've even talked to them. And I think that's a big thing too. A lot of people do want to hear what you have to say. I've met so many coaches and mentors who've been in the workforce a lot longer than I have, and they've been so generous with their time and talking to me. And I think that's a tool in itself that is maybe underutilized. There are so many people who want to have those conversations. And even though they're an older generation, we might assume they don't want to hear what I have to say. A lot of the time they do. And that's something to work on as well.
Yeah, those assumptions are convenient, but as Lindsay said, don't trade accuracy for convenience.
Correct. Yeah, so I mean, we're gonna have to find a way to get Lindsay on here again. Hopefully, if she'll put up with us. So we'll keep everyone updated on that.
We'll have to bribe her with some swag.
I think we can handle that. We'll figure it out. On our next episode, we will actually be joined by my mom, and we will be discussing the impact of culture and how people often even carry that impact into their personal lives.